What if the foundations of modern financial power were not built by corporations, governments, or global institutions, but by a single family operating centuries before capitalism had a name? And what if everything we recognize today as economic structure, monetary influence, and geopolitical leverage is simply an upgraded version of the mechanisms they engineered in silence? Most people look at Wall Street, central banks, or multinational companies and assume these are the ultimate architects of financial dominance. But history hides patterns, and one of the most disturbing is that long before corporate empires existed, a family with no official throne shaped the economic machinery we now depend on. Their story is almost never taught, almost never discussed, and yet their fingerprints appear everywhere in the evolution of currency control, debt systems, cross-border influence, and the manipulation of crises to consolidate power. To understand how this happened, you have to forget everything you think you know about capitalism, because capitalism as we experience it today did not emerge naturally or accidentally. It was constructed, shaped, tested, refined, and behind that construction was a network built with precision, using tools that were far ahead of their time. They operated in a world where information moved slowly, governments were clumsy and corrupt, and empires rose and fell by force alone. But this family looked at the world differently. They realized that while kings ruled land, someone else could rule flow of money, flow of resources, flow of influence. And whoever controlled flow did not need political titles, they only needed strategy. This is the part most people miss when looking at historical crises and modern financial events. Patterns repeat, not because history is cyclical, but because the systems created long ago were designed to reproduce themselves. If you have ever wondered why economic collapses follow similar trajectories, why debt grows endlessly, or why certain institutions always seem to benefit from instability, it is because those mechanisms were built deliberately. They originated in a blueprint crafted by people who understood that real power does not shout. It whispers, it structures, it embeds itself so deeply that future generations mistake it for a natural law. And once you see how this family operated, the way they moved across continents, influenced markets, and anticipated global behavior long before the world was global, you start to question everything. You start to see connections you were never meant to see. You start to realize that what shapes nations is often not nationalism, ideology, or leadership, but an invisible architecture built in the shadows of history. Have you ever felt that the world economy behaves with a pattern too precise to be random? Stay with this thought, because what you will uncover next might change the way you interpret every financial crisis of the modern era. Before we continue, tell me what part of this hidden history resonates with you so far. Leave a comment sharing your view. Make sure to hit like if this opening made you think differently, and check if you are subscribed to the channel so you do not miss the next layers we are about to uncover. To understand when their influence truly began, you have to look at a moment in history when empires were obsessed with visible power. Kings displayed authority through armies, territory, monuments, and alliances. But while the world watched crowns and borders, this family quietly built something far more enduring. They realized that visible power fades, but financial architecture survives collapse after collapse. And instead of attaching themselves to a single ruler, they attached themselves to systems. They studied how wealth moved, how governments depended on credit, how trade routes shaped decisions, and how the weaknesses of empires could be leveraged long before the empires themselves recognized those vulnerabilities. Their rise did not begin with a dramatic event. It began with observation. Unlike aristocrats trapped in tradition, they adapted with ruthless efficiency. They learned the languages of merchants, diplomats, and courts. They inserted themselves into the gaps between governments, filling spaces no one else understood. When markets were primitive, they built structure. When institutions were unreliable, they became the reliable ones. And at a time when communication across regions could take weeks or months, they created networks capable of transmitting information faster than most rulers could issue decrees. Information, mobility, and adaptability became their currency long before money was their weapon. This is the part of the story that exposes the first hidden pattern. Empires rise through force, but real influence rises through access. While monarchies were distracted by wars and territorial pride, this family invested in something far more strategic, relationships that transcended borders. They could speak to kings, merchants, bankers, ship captains, and diplomats with equal fluency. They learned to predict political shifts before they happened, not through prophecy, but through data long before anyone used that word. They monitored trade flows, shortages, conflicts, and financial stress points. They recognized that governments were always more fragile than they appeared, and fragility creates opportunity. Their influence grew because they understood a truth that empires ignored. The stability of a state depends on perception. But the stability of a financial network depends on structure. States crumble when the public loses faith. Networks expand when participants rely on them. And this family provided reliability in a world defined by chaos. They financed operations when states were desperate. They stabilized supply chains when wars disrupted trade. They offered credit when treasuries were empty. And every time they acted, they embedded themselves deeper into the economic bloodstream of entire regions. By the time rulers realized how dependent they had become, it was already too late. The family had positioned themselves not in front of the throne, but beneath it, supporting structures the throne itself relied on. Their power came not from commanding armies, but from quietly holding the mechanisms that determined whether armies could be fed, supplied, or even mobilized. And once a ruler depends on someone who operates outside the political spotlight, that person or that family becomes indispensable. What emerged from this period was not just influence, but an early prototype of financial capitalism itself, shaped by people who understood that controlling flow was more powerful than controlling land. And as their network expanded, so did their ability to withstand the collapses that destroyed entire empires, because they were not tied to a single flag. They were tied to the system underneath every flag. As their influence expanded, they began constructing something far more sophisticated than a trading network. They were engineering a financial operating system long before anyone understood what such a system meant. While most merchants focused on commodities and most rulers focused on borders, this family focused on mechanisms that controlled credit, trust, liquidity, and the flow of capital across distances that empires struggled to govern. They realized early that money was not simply exchanged, it was orchestrated, and the one who orchestrates does not need to reveal his hand. This is where their brilliance becomes unmistakable. They understood that the true weakness of every empire was not military capacity, but financial fragility. Wars were rarely lost on battlefields. They were lost when treasuries ran dry. Economies did not collapse because people lacked goods. They collapsed because systems lacked confidence. So rather than compete with rulers, the family positioned themselves as the invisible architects who stabilized the very structures that kept rulers in power. They created channels for debt, converted risk into opportunity, and developed early models of diversification that allowed them to survive shocks that destroyed nations. Their methods were not improvised. They built frameworks that mirrored the logic of modern financial institutions, centuries before such institutions existed. They standardized credit across regions, so merchants trusted their guarantees more than the promises of kings. They made trade flow faster by ensuring payments could be honored anywhere, transforming reputation into capital long before credit ratings were invented. And most importantly, they learned to turn crisis into leverage. When empires panicked, they remained calm. When economies trembled, they expanded. When rulers begged for funds, they negotiated from strength. They mastered arbitrage in a world that did not yet have the vocabulary for it. They studied price discrepancies between regions, political tensions that could alter supply routes, and currency fluctuations triggered by war or famine. Every imbalance was an opportunity, and every opportunity reinforced their dominance. They built redundancy into their network so that if one region collapsed, another compensated. They diversified across industries, currencies, and territorial powers, creating a structure that was nearly impossible to destabilize. Their financial intelligence was not theoretical, it was practical, tested across decades of upheaval. What truly set them apart, however, was their understanding of information as a strategic asset. They cultivated sources across courts, ports, and marketplaces. They gathered data from diplomats, travelers, and agents embedded in trade hubs. While rulers relied on slow, unreliable channels, this family operated with speed and accuracy. They could anticipate shortages, political shifts, or military movements before official reports even existed. In a world where timing determined fortune or ruin, they were always ahead. This engineering of economic power also revealed another hidden pattern that still shapes capitalism today. Whoever provides stability during instability becomes indispensable. As empires cycled through debt, conflict, inflation, and collapse, the family remained the constant force capable of smoothing volatility, and the more indispensable they became, the less visible their influence had to be. Their power worked best in silence, embedded deep within the systems others assumed were natural. By the time the world realized what they had constructed, modern capitalism had already inherited their blueprint, a framework where influence is exercised not through authority but through infrastructure. And the next stage of their ascent would transform empires themselves, because no ruler could resist those who controlled the mechanisms that made prosperity possible. As their mechanisms grew more sophisticated, empires began to shift in ways that seemed natural on the surface but were anything but accidental. The family had learned that influence was most effective when it was indirect, subtle, and disguised as necessity. They understood that rulers rarely changed course because of ideology. They changed course because economic pressure quietly forced their hand, and the ones who controlled that pressure did not need crowns or armies. They only needed to position themselves where every political decision intersected with financial survival. This is where their strategy became almost surgical. When an empire prepared for war, they offered liquidity at precisely the moment fear tightened markets. When rulers sought expansion, they provided credit that came with invisible strings. When treasuries faltered, they stabilized currency flows in exchange for informal privileges that slowly accumulated into real leverage. And it happened behind closed doors, under the assumption that financial assistance carried no political cost. But nothing they offered was neutral. Every transaction nudged power in a direction that suited their long-term interests. They manipulated timing with extraordinary precision. If a rival empire showed signs of weakness, they shifted capital to reinforce the stronger side, creating an imbalance that accelerated collapse. If tensions threatened trade routes, they financed alternative pathways, ensuring they controlled the arteries through which wealth circulated. Their interventions often determined whether a ruler remained in power or fell. Empires believed they were acting independently, but their choices had already been shaped by the financial environment engineered around them. What most historians overlook is the psychological dimension of their influence. Rulers, desperate to maintain stability, began to trust the family more than their own advisors. Unlike political allies, this family had no territory to defend, no borders to threaten, no ideology to impose. They offered what appeared to be pure pragmatism. And that illusion of neutrality made them even more dangerous. They could steer empires without appearing to steer anything at all. They could create conditions where leaders believed the ideas were their own. Over time, the family developed a pattern that would later become the backbone of modern financial manipulation. They learned that crises were catalysts. A war, a currency failure, a famine, or a trade disruption was not merely an event, it was an opening. During chaos, rulers became pliable, institutions became desperate, and entire populations became vulnerable to shifts that would have been impossible in stable periods. Crises revealed leverage points, and the family used those moments to tie empires more tightly into their network, ensuring that dependence became permanent. This system of influence was not maintained through force, but through inevitability. By shaping the financial realities around empires, they made themselves the solution to problems they had quietly helped accelerate, and each cycle of intervention embedded them deeper into global power structures. The truth is that many empires never understood how deeply they were being guided. They believed they were navigating history, when in reality, they were following paths carved beneath their feet long before they took their first step. If you have ever sensed that major historical shifts feel orchestrated rather than spontaneous, this is where that intuition begins to make sense. And before we move deeper into how this strategy reshapes societies, tell me what you think. Does this pattern of silent manipulation remind you of anything modern? Leave your comment sharing your perspective so far. For all the elegance of their strategy and the sophistication of their financial mechanisms, the expansion of this family's influence carried a cost that history often minimizes or ignores. Economic systems do not grow in a vacuum. They grow by extracting value from societies, redirecting wealth from some hands into others, and reshaping the daily reality of people who never chose to participate in those transformations. And as the family's reach expanded across continents, entire populations experienced the consequences of a financial blueprint designed not for equity, but for efficiency and control. Behind every loan to an empire lay a chain reaction that reached farmers, merchants, laborers, and communities who had no voice in the decisions that determined their fate. When rulers borrowed to fund wars, it was ordinary citizens who suffered the inflation that followed. When empires restructured their economies to satisfy creditors, it was local industries that collapsed under pressure. When currency values shifted to accommodate financial agreements, wages lost purchasing power, goods became scarce, and families were thrust into cycles of instability they could not escape. The brilliance of the family's system is often celebrated today as innovation, but innovation comes with a shadow. Centralization of financial influence meant decentralization of social stability. Regions that once thrived on local trade found themselves dependent on distant capital flows. Communities that had relied on predictable currency values were suddenly vulnerable to fluctuations triggered hundreds of miles away. And laborers who once understood the structure of their economic world were forced into systems that operated too far above their lives to comprehend. What made the situation even more impactful was how invisible these changes appeared. People did not see a family making decisions. They saw prices rising, taxes climbing, currencies weakening, or opportunities shrinking. They blamed their rulers, their neighbors, or themselves, not realizing that the architecture of their hardship had been constructed elsewhere. Economic pressure became a tool, and societies endured consequences disproportionate to their role in creating the conditions that caused them. As the financial network expanded, the family also redefined risk. Once, risk was local, tied to weather, harvests, or local politics. Now risk was global, a reflection of decisions made in courts, ports, and private meetings. A famine in one region could be worsened by strategic withholding of credit. A political dispute could escalate because the wrong faction lost access to capital. Population displacement, economic migration, and social unrest were not random. They were outcomes shaped by invisible financial currents. This dynamic reveals a deeper pattern in the formation of global capitalism. Systems of power rarely evolve to protect the many. They evolve to secure the position of the few who understand how to shape those systems. And while the family never sought public fame, their influence, intentionally or not, created winners and losers on a scale that transformed entire civilizations. The quiet expansion of their financial reach meant that society's stability no longer depended solely on local governance. It depended on the unseen architects who structured the flow of wealth itself. The human cost was real, measurable, and often devastating. But because it was diffused across generations and geographies, it became a background condition of life rather than a recognized injustice. And as their influence deepened, the next phase of their strategy would reshape not only economies, but the very concept of global financial networks. As the family's influence expanded beyond regional spheres, they began constructing something astonishing for their time. A financial network that operated across borders with the precision of a modern institution long before such institutions existed. Empires thought in terms of geography. Merchants thought in terms of trade. But this family thought in terms of systems. They understood that controlling isolated regions meant little unless those regions were connected. So they built connections, not through conquest, but through infrastructure the world did not yet have the vocabulary to describe. Their network functioned like an early prototype of global finance. They established nodes in strategic cities, embedding representatives who understood local customs, currencies, risks, and politics. These nodes communicated with each other using methods that made their information flow faster than what governments relied on. Couriers, coded letters, merchant alliances, and overlapping trade partnerships created a web of intelligence that spanned continents. In an era when information determined fortune, they possessed the closest thing the world had to real-time economic awareness. This network allowed them to bypass the limitations of geography. While an empire's influence weakened the moment its armies left a region, the family's influence grew stronger. Each time a new node was added, each location provided insight into market fluctuations, political tensions, supply shortages, and currency pressures. Instead of reacting to events, they anticipated them. Patterns that looked chaotic to rulers appeared structured to them because they had visibility across borders at a scale no political leader could match. But it was not just awareness that made the network powerful. It was coordination. They created standardized practices for evaluating creditworthiness, assessing risk, pricing currency exchanges, and allocating capital. These practices became so reliable that merchants, rulers, and institutions trusted their assessments more than local authorities. When uncertainty rose, they became the stabilizing force. When instability spread, they became the compass others consulted. Reliability transformed into authority, and authority transformed into leverage. At the same time, they built redundancy into their network. If one route failed because of war or famine, another compensated. If one region's currency collapsed, they shifted capital into stronger markets. If political tensions threatened their operations, they rebalanced their influence to minimize exposure. This flexibility resembled the modern logic of decentralized systems, but in their time it was revolutionary. Empires collapsed because they were rigid. The family thrived because they were fluid. Their global reach also gave them something rarer than wealth: neutrality. They were not bound to a single crown. They were not tied to the identity of one nation. They operated above the ideological conflicts that consumed empires. This made them the perfect intermediaries in disputes, the indispensable financiers of both sides in a conflict, and the silent beneficiaries of every reconstruction effort that followed. Whether borders expanded or contracted, their network adapted. Whether systems fractured or realigned, their influence persisted, and gradually, without declarations or ceremonies, they created the foundation of what would become the global financial ecosystem. Modern banking, multinational investment, cross-border credit, currency arbitrage, and international risk management all reflect principles they developed through necessity and foresight. Their success did not depend on ruling land, but on ruling flow. Flow of money, flow of information, flow of opportunity. By the time the world entered its next era of economic transformation, the family's network had become so entrenched that it no longer needed visibility to maintain power. It simply needed the world to keep functioning within the architecture they had designed. But as their influence expanded, another strategy emerged, one that would reveal how deeply they understood the cyclical nature of economic history. As their network strengthened, the family recognized a truth that most rulers never dared to confront. Stability creates comfort, but instability creates opportunity. Empires feared crises because crises exposed their fragility, but the family saw crises as predictable cycles, each one revealing structural weaknesses they could leverage. While nations clung to the illusion of control, the family observed patterns repeating across generations. A currency collapse in one region mirrored the debt spiral of another. A trade disruption replicated the consequences of earlier conflicts. To them, crises were not surprises. They were signals. With this understanding, the family refined a strategy that would define their power for centuries. Rather than merely surviving upheavals, they positioned themselves to benefit from the transitions crises inevitably produced. When an empire's treasury approached exhaustion, they stepped in with credit, secured by terms that quietly deepened future dependence. When inflation eroded public confidence, they offered stabilization mechanisms that made governments reliant on their calculations and reserves. When war shattered economies, they financed reconstruction, ensuring that the new order emerged aligned with their interests. In each case, the crisis did not weaken them, it fortified them. Their advantage came from being structurally external to the systems that crumbled. Empires collapsed under their own weight because they were built on rigid hierarchies, slow communication, and emotional decision-making. The family operated with none of those limitations. Their decisions were dictated by data, not pride. Their loyalty was tied to opportunity, not ideology. And their influence flowed horizontally across borders, unaffected by the rise or fall of any single regime. This mobility allowed them to respond with precision to crises that left rulers paralyzed. But they did more than respond. They learned to anticipate. By studying the economic rhythms of empires, they identified signals that preceded collapse: overstretched militaries, unsustainable debts, declining productivity, widening inequality. These indicators were not random, they formed a sequence. And once the family recognized the sequence, they could act before the crisis unfolded. They shifted capital into safer regions, secured strategic resources, renegotiated long-term agreements, and prepared to extend assistance at the moment rulers realized they had no alternatives. What looked like instinct was simply pattern recognition refined over generations. The deeper their understanding became, the more effectively they shaped the aftermath of each crisis. They did not need to cause instability to benefit from it. Instability was built into the structure of empires themselves. All the family had to do was remain ready. And so each collapse, each war, each financial disruption became another event in a long continuum of transitions that moved wealth and influence away from states and toward the hands of those who understood how cycles truly worked. This approach created a quiet but profound shift in global power. Over time, governments stopped asking whether they needed the family and started asking how soon they could secure their support. And with every crisis navigated, the family embedded itself deeper into the foundations of economic order. The world believed it was rebuilding each time. In reality, it was reinforcing the architecture the family had designed long before. Before we continue, tell me your view. Does this pattern of crises used as leverage remind you of events we still experience today? Share your comment with your perspective on this cycle. By the time the modern age began taking shape, the family's influence had already dissolved into the foundations of global finance so deeply that most people no longer recognized it as influence at all. Their blueprint became the invisible architecture behind institutions that appear natural today: central banks, multinational lenders, credit networks, and cross-border financial agreements. The world assumed these systems were created by governments or evolved through economic necessity. In reality, many of the principles governing them had been tested, refined, and proven effective by the family generations earlier. What the world now calls financial stability rests on frameworks built in the shadows long before the modern state was prepared to manage them. Their legacy endures because these structures work. They create predictability where chaos once ruled. They standardize transactions, protect capital, and ensure liquidity even when nations fall into disarray. But embedded within these benefits lies the deeper truth of their design. These systems centralize influence in the hands of those who understand them and decentralize responsibility onto societies that depend on them. This asymmetry mirrors the earliest strategies the family employed when dealing with empires. They offered stability, and in exchange, they acquired leverage. Today, the same dynamic persists, just under different names and institutions. Consider how modern economies rely on debt as a constant rather than an emergency tool. Governments borrow endlessly, markets depend on credit expansion, and currencies circulate based on confidence rather than backing. These characteristics are not accidental. They reflect the family's original understanding that financial flow must remain continuous for influence to be continuous. Interruptions create vulnerability, and vulnerability creates openings for rivals. So the system evolved to prevent interruptions at any cost, even if that meant normalizing perpetual debt and using crises as catalysts for structural adjustments. Even the way information moves through global finance echoes the family's network model. Markets respond instantly to signals that once took weeks to travel. Investors react not only to events, but to expectations, calculations, and interpretations that mirror the intelligence-driven decision-making the family used centuries earlier. Algorithms now perform at scale what human couriers and coded letters once accomplished in secrecy. The speed has increased, the methods have changed, but the underlying philosophy remains recognizable. Another part of their legacy is the idea that financial power must transcend borders to remain effective. Today, multinational corporations operate in dozens of jurisdictions simultaneously, shifting capital, resources, and influence across regions with a flexibility that mirrors the family's approach to political neutrality. Just as the family aligned with opportunity rather than sovereignty, modern financial giants position themselves above national politics, guided by the logic of global strategy rather than local loyalty. They survive not because any government protects them, but because every government needs them. What makes this legacy so difficult to identify is that it has become the norm. The structures created from their principles shape lending standards, crisis responses, trade agreements, regulatory frameworks, and international negotiations. Most people navigating this system assume it emerged naturally, a progression of economic evolution. But when viewed through the lens of historical patterns, it becomes clear that the system reflects deliberate choices made long before today's institutions existed. And as the world continues to cycle through expansions, contractions, and structural resets, the influence of that blueprint becomes even more evident. Modern financial capitalism is not a spontaneous creation. It is the continuation of a design that began with a family operating in the shadows of empires, understanding that the most enduring power is the kind people never notice. As the modern world embraced the structures shaped by the family's blueprint, something curious happened. The memory of their influence faded, not because their actions were insignificant, but because the systems they created became so normalized that people stopped questioning their origins. And over time, the institutions that inherited their framework had every incentive to keep the narrative focused on nations, leaders, and corporations, rather than on an invisible lineage of financial architects. Power thrives when its mechanisms remain unexamined. One reason this history disappeared is that it challenges the dominant myth of economic progress. Textbooks portray capitalism as an organic evolution driven by innovation, competition, and the natural expansion of markets. But the family's legacy reveals a different reality. Financial capitalism was engineered. It was shaped intentionally, strategically, and above all, selectively. Recognizing this would force societies to confront uncomfortable truths about who benefits from economic stability and who pays the price when systems adapt to protect those at the top. It is far easier to present markets as neutral forces than as structures molded by specific actors. Another reason this story vanished is that the family operated without seeking public recognition. Their influence worked precisely because it remained discreet. They did not build monuments or empires that carried their name. They built networks, agreements, and financial instruments that worked regardless of who ruled. While kings, presidents, and corporations rose and fell, the system they designed endured. When history celebrates visible figures and visible architects disappear by design, their absence from the record is not an omission. It is the natural consequence of how their power functioned. Furthermore, the institutions that inherited their blueprint evolved into entities so vast and complex that tracing their origins became nearly impossible. Central banks, international lenders, regulatory frameworks, and global markets now contain layers upon layers of influence, each iteration buried beneath another. Modern observers see only the surface: interest, rates, bond markets, monetary policies, crisis interventions. The deeper logic that shapes these actions, the same logic the family refined centuries ago, remains hidden behind technical language and bureaucratic structure. Transparency was never the intention. Continuity was. Political incentives also played a role in erasing this history. Governments prefer narratives that position them as the primary actors shaping economic destiny. Acknowledging that their power relies on systems designed externally undermines the illusion of sovereignty. Nations do not want to admit that their fiscal stability depends on mechanisms inherited from a financial lineage they never controlled. So historical accounts elevate the importance of state action while minimizing the significance of those who shaped the frameworks states now depend on. Finally, the public rarely seeks what it has never been taught to question. When people grow up inside a system, they assume it is natural. They interpret its Rhythms as inevitable, its crises as accidents, and its rules as the product of collective logic rather than selective design. And so, the family's influence becomes invisible, not because it lacks importance, but because it has been absorbed into the very structures people take for granted. Yet, the moment you re-examine history through the lens of hidden patterns, the story becomes impossible to ignore. The disappearance of their legacy is itself a clue, a sign that the mechanisms they built have become too integral, too embedded, too powerful to be isolated from the system that surrounds them. And understanding why this narrative was erased is essential, because it reveals that the final stage of their influence still shapes the world today. What remains most striking about the family's legacy is not that they shaped the financial world of their time, but that the pattern they created continues to define the systems we live under today, long after their names disappeared from publics. Memory, the architecture they built, became the foundation on which nations, corporations, and global markets constructed their identities. Modern capitalism, for all its complexity and scale, still moves according to principles the family tested centuries earlier. Influence through flow, leverage through crisis, stability as a bargaining chip, and neutrality as a strategy for survival. These mechanisms have been repackaged with new terminology, but the logic underneath remains unchanged. Look closely and you will see the pattern everywhere. When governments rely on debt to sustain their economies, they are operating within the family's original blueprint. When financial institutions stabilize markets during turmoil, they are echoing tactics refined long before central banks existed. When capital moves seamlessly across borders in search of opportunity, it reflects the neutrality that allowed the family to outlast empires. And when crises reshape entire economic landscapes, it is not randomness at work. It is the same sequence repeating under new circumstances, guided by structures designed to channel instability into influence. Modern audiences are often encouraged to believe that capitalism is too vast, too intricate, or too impersonal to trace back to individual actors. But systems do not emerge from nowhere. They begin with decisions made by people who understand the long game. People who build quietly, adapt relentlessly, and think beyond the horizon of their own generation. The family succeeded not because they forced the world to follow their design, but because they created a design the world eventually needed. As empires rose and fell, as technologies transformed communication and trade, their blueprint remained relevant because it addressed the underlying truth of global power. Those who control the mechanisms beneath society shape society itself. Recognizing this does not diminish the achievements of modern institutions, nor does it suggest some hidden group still pulling strings today. Instead, it highlights how deeply historical structures can influence present-day systems long after their creators vanish. The world we navigate is not accidental. It is built on layers of decisions, innovations, and strategies inherited from architects who understood that real power is not about visibility but durability. And now that you have seen the pattern, the question becomes whether you will look at modern financial events the same way again. The crises that disrupt economies, the policies that shift global markets, the institutions that stabilize or destabilize nations, all of them echo a design older than most people realize. Understanding that design gives you a different lens, a clearer sense of how influence truly works, and a deeper awareness of the forces shaping the world around you. If this journey opened your perspective, stay with me beyond this point. Subscribe to the channel so you can continue exploring the hidden structures that shape history in the present. Leave a comment with the phrase, "I am with you until the end," so I know you reached this final layer. And give a like if this narrative helped you see the modern system with sharper clarity. There is another video waiting that expands on this story and connects the next piece of the puzzle. It is right here beside this one. Click it whenever you are ready and continue the journey with me there.